Welcome everyone to this morning's talk titled Resilience and Repair, Responses to Conflict and Disaster. My name is Mario. I'm from Article 25. We're a charity and we're also architects, and we work in disaster-prone areas around the world, as well as in post-disaster reconstruction. With me today, I have 4 esteemed panelists. Starting from the furthest from me, we have the Ukrainian architect Jenia Gubkina, who is also an architectural and urban historian and curator. Next to her, we have Mehmet Kalyoncu, founder and member of the Board of Trustees from the Turkiye Design Council. Next to him is Amar Azuz, a research fellow from the University of Oxford. And closest to me, we have Harry Blakiston Houston, founder of the charity Insulate Ukraine. And Harry, we're starting with you. I have a few questions. I'll be asking each of the panelists one by one. Let me start with you. So do you want to talk a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing? And maybe you can tell us which is the best way to manage the design process in an active conflict zone.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I'd like to thank the LDF and everyone who's made today possible, and all of you for coming to listen to this talk on resilience and repair. So I'll start off with a little bit of background about really what drove us into this project, and then I will answer your question about what are the sort of tools, what are the approaches that we've found help with applying innovation, applying engineering in a humanitarian context. So to start with, I was studying a PhD in statistics applied to the crop sciences at the University of Cambridge until January 2023. But I have a great interest in the way engineering is applied to the humanitarian sector. The reason being for that is that the humanitarian sector probably has the greatest density of problems for engineers to solve of any sector, I think, out there. And yet the amount of time and focus spent on solving those problems is very, very small. So my thoughts on a good engineer is quite often a person who is very, very, very dedicated towards solving a specific problem. And that then means that the humanitarian sector forms this perfect place to go and apply those skills if you really, really are focused on solving problems. So I lead, as you said, a charity called Insulate Ukraine. Very briefly on that, we are a Ukrainian NGO. It has come off the back of solving a problem of shattered windows, and to date we have now installed over 31,000 of these this new design of emergency replacement window within 0 to 30 kilometers of the front line in the war in Ukraine. So we work clearly in quite a funny context and quite a complicated context. And a major aspect of our approach to this work has been making sure that we really understand the context in which we're working in. We really understand those people we're helping. I think in general that there is a slight misalignment between quite often our approaches to solving problems in these sectors and what we really should be doing. And that misalignment quite often comes from distance. The simple fact that it is very, very difficult to truly understand the context in which you're working if you are doing it from, say, the engineering department in Cambridge. And so I'll start actually by answering your question, which is I tend to apply a pretty similar process each time I go and try and solve a problem. That starts off with understanding the context. Once that context is really rigorously understood, we then look to define a problem within that context. We make sure we flesh out exactly what that problem is, so we really nail it down to a very specific list, and then that constrains our solution. What you find once you go through that process is a solution will tend to make itself apparent, particularly if you're looking for simplicity. Then, once you've done that, you have to go and start collecting the evidence. You have to, after collecting the evidence, make the case to scale your project. And then finally, once the case is made and the funders have been brought on board, to manage your plan. So I'll start off with the context and the problem that we focused on. I said that we went to the front line of the war in Ukraine, and I started off actually trying to find this problem by going and cooking pizzas, which was a slightly surprising one. But the reason for doing this was that it got me onto the ground. It got my boots very quickly into an area of need and allowed me to begin making those connections with people. We then spent 6 months furthering our understanding of the context until eventually we found the right problem that I thought engineers could work on, and that is a problem of shattered glass. Now, every time a bomb drops on the front line of Ukraine, for which there are 10,000 dropping on a daily basis, it will shatter any window within a 50-meter radius. This means that there are millions of people, we estimate 375,000 within the 0 to 30-kilometer zone, the active firing range, who are in need of better installation purely through windows. It's just their windows that have been damaged. So we focused on shattering glass, and from the context perspective, we understood that the aid currently being delivered to these people, which tends to be OSB board, so wooden boards, they basically leave people living in incredibly dark conditions, in incredibly cold conditions, and damp during summer conditions. This means that, I have been into homes on the front line where there is literally ice on the table. You can feel it there. The only source of warmth that that individual will have will be something they put on top of their hob and stand beside to try and warm themselves up a bit. It gets so cold that your limbs ache and your breath freezes inside these homes, and there's very, very little support given to those right on the front line who are most in need. By any means, I think the support that is given to them tends to be inadequate. So we took this issue and looked at the problem, and we defined a couple of specific things that we wanted from a solution that we see would be ideal for a solution. The first one was it needed to keep people warm. So we needed something that insulated about as well as double glazing. We wanted it to let light through. So we wanted people to be able to return to home to a certain extent, to return to that aspect of comfort. We wanted it to be scalable. So we didn't want to have to set up a new manufacturing plant. We wanted to be able to have impact very, very quickly. And so we turned to the aspect of distributed manufacturing, on-site fabrication. And with that, we also needed it to be very simple and easy to install. So essentially, anyone needs to be able to make this thing. Another aspect which was lower down on our list at first, and this was a slight lack of understanding of the context, but it was difficult to get data on it, was we wanted it to be safe from further incoming attacks. This is something that has just skyrocketed in importance since day one, and was within the initial design constraints, but was not one of our core focuses. Now, there are still problems with our solution which we need to improve on, but what we basically developed was a triple glazed polyethylene emergency replacement window. It costs $15 to build and install in homes across the front line. It insulates about as well as a double glazed window, and it provides protection to homes from dampness, from any nasty weathering effects, which means we are protecting the infrastructure on the front line of these towns. The final part is we source all of our materials from within Ukraine. So the materials that we ended up using are some of the world's most abundantly manufactured, and then they are locally installed. Now, This local installation is an important aspect because problems are not solved by a design, by just a solution in the narrow concept. They are solved by systems. So much like the Apple iPhone is more than just a simple product. It is the iPhone, it's more than just a phone. It's the phone plus Apple Care, plus the apps, plus all of these types of things. The same thing is true within the humanitarian sector. With this, what we landed on was a pay-per-installation franchise model. And so we have 4 towns that are installing these windows on a day-to-day basis with paid labor, that sort of stuff. That has allowed us to bring innovation to these towns because these individuals who we are paying on the front line have a better contextual understanding than anyone else in Western Europe. They live this stuff every single day. They have lived it for over 2 years now. They really understand the issues they face, and sometimes they just need a bit of a hand in order to then define the problem and come up with a solution. So I'll skip that one. So I've said we work in these frontline areas, talked a little bit about our impact. This is one of the main ones that I want to come to today, is this constant innovation of how we bring, to really answer your question, of how we bring innovation into this space and how I see a future for innovation within the humanitarian context. These 2 windows are very, very recent, very recent change in design that we've had from the version 1 on the left, which is triple glazed polyethylene, and version 2 on the right, which is its double glazed PET. This is a huge indication of what happens when you give locals the ability to innovate, to understand their context, define their problem, and produce new solutions. And I think it's really the route forward within innovation in this sector.
Right, yeah, exactly. That kind of iterative model of innovation, constantly improving. Yeah, okay. We'll jump onto Amar, so as to keep things moving. Amar, you've written about the concept of slow violence, first coined by author Robert Nixon. Can you explain it in layman's terms? And how does it manifest? What lessons can designers learn from that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mario, for the introduction, and thanks for the organizers for bringing us together today. It's always fascinating to bring different geographies because you feel we are building bridges across different regions and across different cities that they are going through conflicts. As Mario mentioned, I engage with this concept called slow violence, and I have written about it and built on it in this book that I published last year titled Domicide, Architecture, War, and the Destruction of Home in Syria. Has anyone been to Syria before? Just curious to know in the audience. 2, 3, 5, 6, a few names, a few people. Small number, 6 of us, 7 of us, amazing. So sadly, we are living in this time where the world is moving from one war to the other, and somehow not only the slow violence is forgotten, but an entire war is forgotten, such as Syria now. It's a totally forgotten war. And in the book, what I tried to say is that beyond thinking about the moment of destruction in wartime, it's important to think about the violence that happens slowly across cities in different mediums, and that violence and destruction can happen even in peace times between brackets. And here are just some examples from Amnesty International where they are focusing on how the Indian government is creating a new urban planning laws to demolish people's homes, but oftentimes are focused on Muslim communities. So you can see the report here saying, if you speak up, your house will be demolished. And only in the last year, over 500,000 people have been displaced, forcibly evicted from their homes in India. And over 100,000 houses have been demolished. So the idea of slow violence urges us as researchers and academics and architects not only to think about this big moment of destruction or invasion or destruction that we see in the news and everyone forgets the day after, but it is about thinking about the accumulation of different mediums of violence that happens in peace and also in war, to understand how we arrive to the moment that we arrive to in terms of wars or destruction. I focus on Homs, where I'm from. It's a city that was called in 2011 the capital of the revolution. It's the third largest city in Syria, and I left it in 2011 without being able to return. More than half of the neighborhoods have been heavily destroyed in the city, and a quarter of the city has been partially demolished. So as you can see, the city has become the site of violence, the city has become a site of battlefield, and everyday architecture has been destroyed, such as people's homes, schools, hospitals, even bakery shops where people are waiting for their daily bread have been deliberately targeted to destroy people and to destroy their sense of dignity and respect and sense of continuity. So making spaces uninhabitable, as we of course see today also in Gaza. So this is the example of Human Rights Watch recording how many bakery shops and people waiting in bakery lines have been targeted in Syria by the Syrian government and their allies, including Russia. But what happened also in violence, that governments, such as in Syria, creating new laws to destroy and legitimize destruction. So you can see here in the photo on in 2018 how an entire neighborhood has been destroyed, not because of military purposes, but the government started saying that these are informal housing. So even when there's a war going on, they started targeting certain communities. Oftentimes they are opposing to the government and completely erasing them, while at the same time they would keep the houses. They are also labeled informal, but they are supporters of the regime. So this initiating these laws are often selective. And I think like what connects all of us is about the destruction of home, let it be in invasion or earthquake or again in invasion. And I think in the media we always see the numbers of destroyed homes, but we don't hear about the grief of the people who lose their homes. So I'm interested in my book, in my writing, in my research, how do we understand this sense of grief and loss when we are thinking about wars? Two ideas to think about, and I would wrap up, that memory and reconstruction could also be a form of slow violence that emerge in the future, because reconstruction can also be destructive, and the new memorials can also be sites of glorifying certain groups and diminishing other groups. Final slide, I want to say that when people have no homeland, sometimes their art and writing and their work in exile become their own homeland. And I also want to say that artists have a huge role to play in responding to what happens in conflict, such as this artist who drew Homs. She's not from Syria, but it's also the cover of my book. So I'm going to leave it here, and thank you so much, Mario, for having us.
So many concepts. You kind of jumped through a whole series of them. And yeah, all of them really interesting, especially on the kind of idea of rebuilding cities and how you kind of deal with the difficulties that happened before and are happening after. And I think that's a really good leeway to kind of move on to the next speaker, which is Mehmet. And you've been working together with the Turkey Design Council on reconstruction programs. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experience in approaching post-disaster recovery, and how can you, and maybe the question really is, how can you foster unity and trust, especially in these kind of extreme conditions that you get in? Over to you.
Thank you, Mario. So I think communities have unity if they have a common threat or something they love in common. We found a way that we could really design a city that the people of Hatay love in common, and that united them. After we experienced the big earthquakes in 2023. And it was a big demolition in 4 cities in southeastern Turkey. One of them is Hatay. And the city center, Antakya, is an old Roman city. At the time, it was the 3rd biggest city in Roman Empire. So it has very historical roots. And most of the times, who designs the city is the biggest question, right, in the history. And in extreme times, it becomes a bigger question, and it becomes more important, because the impact of the decisions at those times are bigger than normal times. So in our case, as an NGO, being responsible for the future of the city, making the important decisions, which is one of the biggest responsibilities that one can take in life, making decisions that thousands will experience in that city, is, I think, one of the first examples globally. And it worked well. Because we had a big table, but small chairs. As Harry said, people in the cities, in forefront, in the places where the real thing is happening, they can give you significant insights about what you should do in the first hand.
Right.
So this was our major point, how it made everything possible. I think it is active listening. And it was through many different types of meetings in Hatay, in Istanbul, even in London, because we wanted to make sure that the city plan that we are proposing is also enabling new thoughts globally. That's the main reason why we worked with Foster and Partners, Bureau Happold, and so on. And these are the meetings that we had in 8 months in a time of crisis where more than 50,000 people lost their lives in an urgency. So this was also one of the biggest challenges, that to find the time at a time where there's no time for listening others in extreme times. And this also made us to invent our role, because again, in difficult times, no one is there being ready to differentiate what role is parties taking, being so systematic. It is the same in post-war and post-disaster environments. And this was our role, to collect data, because to access to data was one of the main challenges when you lost your capacity in terms of human capital, materials, and data. Second is understanding the decision makers. Most of the time, civil societies tend to become negative about decision makers, which is not really helping to change things. It is always understanding them. Of course, we have an idea, and understanding the people, and finding the one possible thing that is serving all. I think we found that one in our case. We did all the technical drawings, briefs to the designers, because we worked with more than 46 design, planning, engineering studios in our collaboration group to deliver the master plan. And also one critical thing is in extreme times is the flow of information. We want to make sure the people that need the information have it at the right time. And in extreme times, our normals change. The roles change, because obviously these are the times we have bigger problems than we are used to. And it becomes more important to listen to someone than to talk. And emotions are everywhere. People are very emotional. So you should be aware of addressing their emotions with your actions. And of course, being together and allowing others to give their thoughts and ideas is important. And the magic is to find the balance between urgency and quality. And in our case, it was also our success delivering that. And this is the master plan for the center of the city, where more than 40 studios work together in such a short time, in a time of crisis. You see the same roundabout in all 3 images to understand how the change is happening. So after we delivered the design, now it is under construction, and hopefully less than 2 years we will see the reality after all the suffering. And the issue about trust and unity. In Turkey, what we experienced was another challenge for us to really show an example where government is trusting an NGO and NGO is trusting to the government. And of course, this is possible by the people of Hatay trusting the NGO.
Right.
So establishing this common trust was a very important issue for us. These are some images before the earthquake and how it will be the same place after the master plan will be deployed. Of course, it's an historical city, so preservation plan was one of the main deliverables. And most importantly, establishing local capacity, because we cannot be there all the time. Locals should continue to work as it has been done. And this is from the local community center where there are designers and engineers, but also became a spot for the people of Hatay where they do several things. And today, ironically, we are in a time where we lose many cities. At the same time, the urbanism is at its highest. This makes urbanism an important issue. But of course, Build Back Better efforts are more important than ever. And lastly, I think this is what we need. An intersection between humanitarian community and people that have knowledge, passion, and interest about cities, or a strong collaboration in between. And it is our ambition to find the right people to deliver this for humanity for a next step.
Or the redevelopment, yeah. I'm hearing a lot about, kind of really getting down to the context of the situation, listening to the people and finding ways to basically gain that information from the people on the ground. And also there's quite a bit of conversation about, both designers and NGOs. And I wonder whether I could just very quickly get an idea from the audience, showing with a kind of a show of hands, whether there's, any designers amongst you. I assume quite a few of you are designers of some description. Yeah, maybe kind of about half of you, I guess. And out of you then, how many are kind of working for NGOs or, associated with the charity sector? Okay, there's a few of you there as well. That's really good. So we've got the right mix of audience, for what you're saying. Okay, so I'll move on to Jenia. You're the last but not least. And I think you have a slightly different message to talk about. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your story and tell us, give us an idea of what role designers should play in global politics, if anything. It's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, 1 million question. Thank you very much. So maybe the first slide. It would be a perfect background, I think. Yeah, it is perfect. So actually, there is the image of my native city, Kharkiv. I'm a Kharkiv architect, urban planner, and historian of architecture. Before the full-scale invasion, all my topics, they were connected with modernism, brutalism, postmodernism, and everything in between. I wrote maybe 4 or 5 books. One of which is actually dedicated to Slavutic. It was the city which was built after Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. So actually I worked with post-catastrophic architecture, with catastrophic architecture conditions, and so on. And most of my books and thoughts, definitely, they were somehow built into the discourse of criticism of totalitarian architecture and totalitarian approach to actually society, and how to build cities, how to build so-called planned cities or new cities without any permissions, any dialogues, any debates with actually people. And usually it was our point of view, it was our main stress in the whole, our criticism and so on. And before the full-scale invasion, I was a director of NGO, and we wanted actually to make some kind of, I don't know, revolution in academy, putting forward actually the discourse of the need of people to be at least seen in the architectural history, not talking only about the glory of the beautiful Soviet avant-garde or Soviet modernism, and despite actually people's lives. So, but after the 24th of February, me and my daughter, we left our country, and my long journey was through the whole Europe, and then maybe only in the summer of 2022 I appeared here. And I have been teaching at the Bartlett School of Architecture already for 2 years. This year I hope that my next book will be published. It would be the actually architectural guidebook to Kharkiv. But the main question is actually guidebook should guide someone somewhere, but how could you guide someone to the war, to the place where nobody wants to go, because it's quite a dangerous place. And this summer, it was my first time when I returned to Kharkiv. It was very emotional, and the experience of returning to your native city, which is in the condition of war. Actually, it was something that push you to face reality. And to face reality is something very important, to see it, to say it and sort it, you know. But maybe we should just forget about the idea of the 20th century architects and modernists to sort something, to fix something. Sometimes it's much more important just to see and to hear. I visited one of the most demolished districts in Kharkiv, which name is Saltivka. So that is the central part of the city. You can see all this historical environment, but this is Saltivka. Saltivka was quite huge. Actually, it was nearly 500,000 people who lived there. It's nearly 1/3 of the whole population of the city. And it was just on the front line in March and in April 2022. That's why it was targeted by missiles, Russian missiles, directly, precisely, consciously, which is something that I think people from the West actually didn't realize. And maybe even me, not being there in this moment, just on my way here, in 2022, I didn't understand the scale of disaster. I didn't understand the quantitative factors and characteristics of destruction. So I've been at Saltivka district for 2 days, and I can say that each building, each panel prefabricated, this kind of mass housing, concrete, gray and ugly Soviet heritage building, modernist building, was hit by missile. So each building had a huge hole or wound inside it. Each, literally each. That is something surprising, because when we can see the destruction in Ukraine, and we can see this mass housing areas, we would think that it's just the same building, because all of them, they were mass housing that were made according to so-called Syria projects and or typical projects and so on. And we can't realize that they are all different. For us, they are all the same. Like, okay, maybe some 9-story building in Ukraine. But actually, that is thousands of the same buildings. And what is very important, maybe you know that Norman Foster Foundation organized the competition on the development of master plan ideas on Saltivka district. And I may assume that for them it was just mass housing district which looked ugly, Soviet heritage, and that's all. And maybe architects and designers should invent something nice and interesting for all these poor people. But what is really important to understand that for these people, it's not ugly place. It's actually their home. They love this place. They know this place. They care about this place, and it's not the problem. As people there from Saltivka all the time, they just show to the north where Russian army is situated and said me, this architecture, architects, us, politicians, it's not a problem. They are the problem. So we should understand that people sometimes, they are much wiser, smarter, more creative, more sensitive and empathic than architects and designers. It's not the time for our ego. Definitely we are all well educated in the atmosphere and the culture of narcissism for architects. It's not the time for Le Corbusier. It's not the time for post-war projects like 1955, post-war projects according to Siam Congress and so on. There is no place for such kind of ego. It's the story. This story is not about us. This story is not about architects. This story, it never actually was about architecture. It's all about people. So it's very important, and it would be a great step. It would be a great change in the whole debates on architecture and the future of architecture thinking and the educational process, just to start talking to people, ask people, and just reject all this savers syndrome. Just ask people, talk to people. It will be enough.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think thank you very much. And I think it's pretty much the same message that all the speakers have been saying. It's always about listening to people on the ground, talking to people on the ground. And I wonder whether, Mehmet, I mean, your process, with all those meetings and, the many months of consultation, you feel that you got to kind of a point there where everyone was listening and really understanding what was going on the ground. And I don't know, I mean, I think you are very kind of emotional about pointing out particular companies and practices. I don't know, what do you think, Mehmet?
Well, I agree with her because we worked with Foster and Partners for our master plan also. It is not something we are used to leave the authority that we have and leave it to the people whom they deserve. And after a war or after a disaster, what would be a greater time than this, to give people some opportunity to talk and express themselves about the future of their cities. And I paid attention to her, and I think emotions are very valuable. I think emotions should be understood better in these times. So I think the good thing that we did was to be neutral. We were just there, listening people, not commenting on their thoughts, not trying to convince them on something, just giving them a chance. Jimi Hendrix has a good saying, knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. So wiser people listen. And by listening, you then have the chance to talk at the last, and which is the most important saying.
Right. Well, that's really interesting you just said that. And actually, we've kind of gone like quite a way through our time, and the audience has been listening, and perhaps there's a chance for them to ask a few questions if they have any. I'll just give you a moment to think through your questions if you have them by asking a very quick question to the panel. I thought it would be really great if we just had kind of a very quick discussion about this idea of displacement, because a lot of the communities that kind of, go through a disaster or a conflict are then displaced. And how does that kind of interact with the design process? How can you get their messages through? I'm just giving you a very short amount of time because then we'll have a chance for 1 or 2 questions.
It's difficult. I think just a comment so we have time for the Q&A. I think it's important to acknowledge that many displaced people do not return to their homelands in their lifetimes. And that's maybe one of the most painful realities that many people are facing. In Syria, there are 6.5 million refugees outside of the country. Millions of them are unable to return. And of course, if we look at history, we see how many people have not been able to return. So the question for us as designers or academics, what does that mean for us? And how can we think about seeing their city from elsewhere? What does Palestine mean in diaspora? What does Syria mean in exile? These questions are important questions for me and as an academic, and I'll just maybe leave it here.
Right, perfect. Are there any questions?
I have a practical question for the gentleman from Insulate, Ukraine. I was amazed that you managed to manufacture those windows in quite a few different areas in Ukraine, and setting up a supply chain to manufacture a product that is not common. I'm sure this didn't exist before the war, is difficult at any time, especially in a time of conflict, and how you managed to translate that idea from one city to the next and to the next would be really interesting to understand.
I can be very quick on it, which is probably helpful. It was part of, as I said, the constraints of the problem. And with that, there are approaches to it that we saw a lot during the pandemic, which is distributed manufacturing. That then means that your problem becomes, what is your material choice? What is the process of manufacturing? We literally build these windows like you would build a wooden table. We build them in a person's home. So we don't have to go off to centralized manufacturing. We don't have to set that up. We literally ship the materials to the town. Someone stands in front of a window, they measure up that window, and they will build the window in place, and it can basically fit to any size of things. I mean, we have done buildings, hospitals we've done some buildings with over 1,000 windows in them. Really, really big buildings, and it all comes down to just making sure that is in the design constraints that you start with, because there are ways of doing that stuff, and it simplifies the whole supply chain process.
Yeah, I emphasizes the importance of design, but still to actually set that up, I assume they were made locally.
Yep.
Yeah, so to set that up and then set up a pipeline of them and then start in the next city, it is still quite amazing.
I think there's someone with a microphone up there, yeah?
Thank you very much. A very interesting panel. I still work in humanitarian aid. I worked for many years for Médecins Sans Frontières and now WHO. And I was just wondering, one of the things that you see, even if you go now down to downtown Beirut, is there's still buildings that are completely abandoned, And I was just wondering, everyone says, oh, it's cheaper to just put something new up than to rebuild. And there's so much waste and destruction. And I was just wondering, given that you don't necessarily always have the big bulldozers, realistically, how is it possible to rebuild using what's there and also all the plastic waste that aid agencies bring in? I've seen it, tons and tons of plastic. Can't you use that to make your windows? Thanks.
Back to windows. So I couldn't agree more with the plastics that aid agencies bring in. A lot of this, I think, is bad problem definition again, because they haven't thought about things like UV destabilization. They haven't thought about things like incentivized recycling. They haven't really taken those aspects into account, which local people do care about as well in these areas. There are a lot of materials that can be used locally, but I think often and I know charities that do the sort of recycling of building materials process, often really you want to, it's quite difficult to directly reuse the materials. You might actually need to go through some process of recycling. There are organizations who are doing that on the ground locally. What they need is fundamentally more funding to expand their operations, because they're providing a solution. They're just currently underfunded. And I think there is a way forward, but money needs to be going into to support innovative projects within these areas like them. And that comes with, in my opinion, more of a change in the approach that people find in innovative projects and learn to support them.
I don't know whether you'd like to talk about the demolition.
I think without a plan, it doesn't work. So there should be a plan. And people, the communities, if they don't understand about theoretically or systematically about a plan, then you should give them something. Maybe it can be a one image, one render, one something, I don't know, a couple of things that they start believing in a better Beirut can be possible. Then some things start to change. And obviously, it is only possible if someone designs the city, plans for the city, and gives a function, a use, a facade. All of these are design issues. So someone should design it, but no one does. Why? If they don't have a political or economic benefit. So I think to give hope, to unite them with design, might start these unplaced buildings to return back to life.
Thank you very much. So we've actually hit the 50-minute mark, and it's a pity because I think we were barely getting started with this. But I'd like to thank everyone for attending and for joining the session. And also, I'd like to thank the speakers for giving us their wisdom. Yeah, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.